Chapter 1. The Bells of St. Mary's. The fog rolled into Chipping End like a slow, deliberate guest, muffling the cobblestone streets and draping the village in a ghostly veil. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the window of her niece's cottage, peered, through the mist, toward the spire of St. Mary's Church. She had arrived only that morning, intending a quiet visit with her niece Margaret, who had recently married a local solicitor. But Chipping End, it seemed, had other plans. As the clock struck 9, a strange sound pierced the stillness. The bells of St. Mary's, which had rung faithfully for centuries, began to toll, not in their usual melodic cascade, but in a jarring, unnatural sequence. Backward, Miss Marple thought, her knitting needles pausing in mid-stitch. Recleuve. The notes seemed to unravel time itself, each clang a defiance of order. Margaret burst into the parlour, her face pale. "Aunt Jane, did you hear that? The bells, they're wrong!" Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Backward bells are rare, my dear. In old times they signalled calamity or treachery. Has this happened before, Didden?" Shook her head, twisting her apron. "Never. The villagers are already talking. They say it's a bad omen. Some even claim the church is cursed." "Nonsense," Miss Marple said briskly, though her mind was already turning. "Curses are often just human mischief dressed up in superstition. Tell me, who tends the bells?" "Old Mr. Harrow, the bell-ringer. But he's been ill, and young Tom Weaver's been helping him. Oh, Aunt Jane, it's so eerie!" Miss Marple patted her niece's hand. "Eerie, perhaps, but not inexplicable. I think I'll take a walk to St. Mary's tomorrow. Fresh air does wonders for clarity." That night, as the fog thickened, Miss Marple lay awake, the backward bells echoing in her memory. She recalled a story from her youth in St. Mary Mead, of bells rung in reverse to warn of invasion. But Chipping End was no coastal village, and the only invaders here seemed to be fear and rumour. Something, she sensed, was stirring beneath the village's quaint surface, something that had chosen this night to announce itself. The next morning, Miss Marple donned her best hat and strolled toward the church, her stick tapping lightly on the path. The village was abuzz, with knots of locals whispering outside the post office and the baker's shop. She caught fragments of their talk. Never heard such a sound. Like the devil himself was in the tower. What does it mean? At St. Mary's, the vicar, Mr. Clement, greeted her with a strange smile. He was a thin man in his 50s, with a habit of rubbing his hands as if washing away some unseen stain. "Miss Marple, a pleasure. Margaret mentioned you'd be visiting. I trust you weren't disturbed by last night's oddity." "The bells, you mean?" she said, her tone mild. "Most curious. I understand Mr. Harrow has been unwell. Was young Tom Weaver in the tower last night?" The vicar hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the churchyard. "Tom, yes. A good lad, but, well, he swears he didn't touch the ropes. Says the bells rang of their own accord." Miss Marple's lips twitched. Bells, in my experience, rarely act without assistance. "Might I see the tower?" "Of course," Mr. Clement said, though he seemed reluctant. He led her through the ancient church, its stone walls cool and damp, to a narrow staircase winding up to the bell tower. The ropes hung still, their ends frayed from years of use. Miss Marple noted a faint scuff mark on the floor, as if something heavy had been dragged. "Tom was alone?" she asked. "So he says," the vicar replied, rubbing his hands again. "I was in the vestry, preparing tomorrow's sermon. I heard the bells and ran out, but by then they'd stopped." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the tower's shadowed corners. "And no one else was seen near the church?" "Not that I know of," Mr. Clement said too quickly. As they descended, a cry rang out from the churchyard. Miss Marple hurried. Outside, the vicar close behind. A small crowd had gathered near an old yew tree, their faces ashen. At their feet lay a grave, its earth freshly turned, the headstone tilted as if pushed by an unseen hand. The grave was empty. Miss Marple knelt, ignoring the damp grass, and studied the headstone. Eleanor Grayson, 1870-1920. Rest in peace. The soil was loose, with no sign of the coffin that should have lain beneath. "Gracious," she murmured. "It seems the bells were only the beginning." "Hold on, detective, before we proceed. Reveal your location. Where are you uncovering these dark truths? Comment below. And if you dare to dive deeper into the shadows, subscribe now. Tomorrow's case plunges into even deeper darkness. Stay vigilant. Chapter 2. The Open Grave. The churchyard of St. Mary's was a patchwork of ancient headstones, their inscriptions softened by time and moss. But the grave of Eleanor Grayson stood out like a fresh wound, its earth churned and raw under the morning sun. Miss Marple stood at its edge, her hands clasped around her stick, her eyes tracing the scene with the quiet precision of a seamstress measuring cloth. The crowd of villagers hovered nearby, their whispers a low hum of fear and curiosity. "Who could do such a thing?" muttered Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, clutching her shawl. "Digging up a grave! It's unholy!" "Perhaps it wasn't dug up," said young Tom Weaver, his face pale under a shock of red hair. Maybe she walked out herself." A nervous laugh escaped him, but it died under the glares of the others. Miss Marple turned to the vicar, who stood wringing his hands beside her. "Mr. Clement, when was this grave last tended? It seems remarkably undisturbed, save for this excavation." The vicar blinked, as if startled by the question. "Tended? Oh, not recently. The Graysons have no living kin here, and Eleanor's been gone. 60 years? The groundskeeper, Mr. Dobbs, checks the churchyard weekly, but he's not mentioned anything amiss." "And yet," Miss Marple said, her tone mild, "the earth is freshly turned, and the coffin is gone. Curious, don't you think?" She knelt, her knees protesting, and examined the soil. It was loose, with no signs of the hard-packed layers one would expect after decades. A few small stones lay scattered nearby, and she picked one up, noting a faint scratch on its surface, as if struck by a metal tool. Her fingers brushed something else, a shred of cloth, dark and frayed, caught in the dirt. She tucked it into her handkerchief, unnoticed by the crowd. "Mr. Dobbs," she called to the groundskeeper, a grizzled man leaning on a spade at the edge of the group. "Have you seen anyone lingering in the churchyard these past few nights?" Dobbs scratched, his beard, his eyes narrowing. "Can't say I have, ma'am, but I don't come round after dark. Not since, well, you know, the bells last night. Gives a man the shivers." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already sifting through possibilities. A grave did not open itself, nor did a coffin vanish without purpose. She glanced at the headstone again. Eleanor Grayson, 1870–1920. The name tugged at a memory, something Margaret had mentioned about the village's history. The Graysons had once been prominent, their manor the heart of Chipping End, until misfortune or scandal had scattered the family. "Vicar," she said, rising, "is there a record of Eleanor Grayson's burial, or of her life, for that matter?" Mr. Clement hesitated, his gaze darting toward the church. "The parish records should have something. They're kept in the vestry, though they're not well organised, I'm afraid. I can look if you think it important." "I do," Miss Marple said, her smile gentle but firm. "Details, however small, often light the way." As the crowd began to disperse, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes sweeping the churchyard. The yew tree's shadow stretched long and dark, and she noticed a faint indentation in the grass beneath it, as if someone had stood there for some time, watching. She filed the observation away, along with the cloth and the scratched stone. Back at the cottage, Margaret was waiting, her hands fluttering as she set out tea. "Aunt Jane, the whole village is talking about that grave. They're saying it's a ghost or worse. What did you find?" "Only questions, my dear," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair. "But questions are a start. Tell me, what do you know of Eleanor Grayson?" Margaret frowned, pouring tea. "Not much. She was a Grayson, of course, part of the old family that owned Grayson Manor. I think she died young, maybe in her 40s. There's a story that she was, well, not quite right in the head. People used to say she wandered the moors at night, talking to herself. But that's just village gossip." "Gossip," Miss Marple murmured, "is often truth in a shabby coat. And the manor? Who owns it now?" "It's been empty for years," Margaret said. "The last Grayson left after the war, and the place has gone to ruin. They say it's haunted, but then they say that about everything in Chipping End." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts circling back to the backward bells and the open grave. A pattern was forming, faint but persistent, like the first stitches of a quilt. Someone had wanted that grave disturbed, and someone had ensured. The bells rang to mark the act. The question was not only who, but why, and what they hoped to hide or reveal in the shadowed heart of St. Mary's churchyard. Chapter 3. The Vicar's Secret. The vestry of St. Mary's Church smelled of old paper and wax, its walls lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of dusty ledgers. Miss Marple sat at a small oak table, her gloved hands carefully turning the brittle pages of the parish records. Mr. Clement hovered nearby, his nervous energy filling the room like static. He had offered to fetch the records himself, but Miss Marple, with her gentle insistence, had persuaded him to let her assist. "These old books are such a treasure," she said, her voice bright. "One never knows what stories they hold. Eleanor Grayson's burial, you said, should be here?" Yes, Mr. Clement replied, rubbing his hands. 1920, I believe. The records from that time are, well, a bit disordered. My predecessor wasn't the tidiest of men." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the faded ink. She had already noted the vicar's unease, the way his gaze darted to the door whenever a floorboard creaked. He was hiding something, not necessarily guilt, but knowledge, and that was often just as telling. At last she found the entry. Eleanor Grayson, died 12th of March 1920, aged 50, Buried 15th of March, St. Mary's Churchyard. Cause of death, heart failure. The handwriting was neat, but a small smudge marred the page, as if someone had hesitated before writing the cause. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Heart failure, she murmured. So common, yet so convenient a term. Was there a doctor in Chipping End, then? Mr. Clement shifted. Dr. Harrow, I believe, old Mr. Harrow's father. Long gone now, of course, Miss Marple echoed, closing the ledger. She glanced at the vicar, her eyes soft but searching. And no one has tended Eleanor's grave in recent years? No visitors, no flowers? Not that I've seen, he said too quickly. His hands stilled, then began their restless motion again. She was the last of her line, you see. The Graysons faded away after her. Miss Marple tilted her head. Faded away or left? Margaret mentioned a Grayson who departed after the war. A nephew, perhaps? The vicar's face tightened just for a moment. Possibly. I don't recall the details. The manor's been empty for decades, as you know. Yes, Miss Marple said, rising. Empty houses have a way of keeping secrets, don't they? Thank you, Mr. Clement. You've been most helpful. As she stepped out of the vestry, the vicar called after her. Miss Marple, you don't think, that is, this business with the grave and the bells, it's not connected to anything sinister, is it? She turned, her smile serene. Oh, I think it's far too early to say, but I find that odd events like backward bells often have very human causes. Outside, the churchyard was quiet, the crowd from the previous day replaced by a lone blackbird hopping among the graves. Miss Marple paused by Eleanor Grayson's open grave, her thoughts circling the vicar's behaviour. His nervousness was not that of a man surprised by events, but of one expecting them, or dreading them, and that smudge in the ledger, so small yet so suggestive, hinted at a record written with reluctance. She walked slowly back to the cottage, her stick tapping the path, her mind weaving together the threads of what she knew. The bells, the grave, the vicar's unease, and now the Grayson family, whose shadows seemed to linger over Chipping End like the fog. Margaret was in the garden when she arrived, pruning roses with a vigour that betrayed her nerves. Aunt Jane, you've been at the church all morning, Margaret said, brushing dirt from her hands. Did you find anything? Only pieces, my dear, Miss Marple replied, settling onto a bench. But pieces can make a pattern given time. Tell me, has Mr. Clement always been so anxious? And he got it, frowned. The vicar? I suppose he's always been a bit jumpy. But it's worse lately. Ever since old Mr. Harrow took ill, and Tom started helping with the bells, people say the vicar's been seen wandering the churchyard at odd hours. Has he now? Miss Marple said, her eyes bright. And does he ever speak of the Graysons? Not that I've heard, Margaret said. But then, no one talks much about them. It's as if the village wants to forget they ever existed. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers tracing the handle of her stick. Forgetting was a choice, and Chipping End had chosen it deliberately. But the backward bells and the open grave were reminders, insistent and unsettling, that some secrets refused to stay buried. She thought of the shred of cloth in her handkerchief, the scratched stone, and the vicar's flickering eyes. Somewhere, in the tangle of the village's past, lay the truth, and she intended to find it. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Village. The village of Chipping End wore its charm like a well-worn shawl, its thatched cottages and winding lanes hiding a multitude of secrets beneath their picturesque surface. Miss Marple, armed with a basket of scones as an excuse for visiting, made her way to the post office, where gossip flowed as freely as the tea at Margaret's cottage. She knew that in a village the truth often hid in the spaces between words, in the glances and silences of its people. Mrs. Tuttle, the postmistress, was a stout woman with a sharp eye and an even sharper tongue. She greeted Miss Marple with a nod, her hands busy sorting letters. "Morning, Miss Marple. Come to post. A letter, or just to see what's stirring in Chipping End?" "A little of both," Miss Marple said, setting her basket on the counter. "These are for you, Mrs. Tuttle. Margaret's recipe, but I helped with the baking. I hear there's been quite a stir since the bells rang backward." Mrs. Tuttle's eyes gleamed. "Oh, aye, and that grave business. Folk haven't stopped talking. Some say it's Eleanor Grayson's ghost, come back to haunt us. Others think it's someone after something buried with her." "Buried with her?" Miss Marple asked, her tone one of polite curiosity. Was there something valuable in her grave? The postmistress leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Well now, no one knows for sure, but the Graysons were rich once, weren't they? Old stories say Eleanor had a locket, gold and set with a ruby, that she was buried with. Never found after her death, they say. Could be someone thought it worth digging for." Miss Marple nodded, filing the detail away. "And who might think such a thing? Has anyone new been about, asking questions?" Mrs. Tuttle hesitated, then shrugged. "No one knew exactly. But young Tom Weaver's been acting queer, always hanging round the church. And then there's Miss Lydia Crane, the school teacher. She's been poking into old records at the village hall, saying it's for a history project. But I reckon she's after something more." "Miss Crane," Miss Marple repeated, her memory stirring. She had seen the schoolteacher at the churchyard, a tall woman with a guarded expression standing apart from the crowd. "Does she have a connection to the Graysons?" "Not that anyone said," Mrs. Tuttle replied, "but she's a sharp one, always watching. And then there's the vicar, of course. He's been jumpier than a cat in a storm since that grave was opened." Miss Marple smiled, offering a scone. "Mr. Clement does seem rather anxious. Has he always been so?" Mrs. Tuttle took the scone, her voice dropping further. "Not always. But a few months back he started getting letters, plain envelopes, no return address. I noticed 'em in the post. He'd go pale as milk when they came, and he'd hurry off to the vestry. Never said a word about 'em, mind. Letters," Miss Marple mused, her eyes bright. "How intriguing! And no one else has been acting out of sorts." "Well," Mrs. Tuttle said, warming to her theme, "there's old Mrs. Grayson, not a real Grayson, mind, but married to Eleanor's cousin. She lives out by the moor, keeps to herself. Folks say she's been seen near the church at dusk, muttering about debts unpaid. But she's half mad, so who knows?" Miss Marple thanked the postmistress and left, her basket lighter, but her mind heavy with new threads. The village was a tapestry of grudges and half-remembered tales, each name a potential stitch in the pattern. Tom Weaver, Lydia Crane, the vicar's letters, and now old Mrs. Grayson, each held a piece of the puzzle, whether they knew it or not. That afternoon she joined Margaret for tea at the village hall, where a small gathering of women was discussing the upcoming fete. Miss Marple listened as the talk inevitably turned to the churchyard mystery. Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, was adamant that the grave's opening was a warning, while Miss Crane, who sat quietly in the corner, said little, but watched everything. Miss Marple approached her during a lull, her smile disarming. "Miss Crane, I hear you're researching Chipping End's history. Have you come across anything about Eleanor Grayson?" The schoolteacher's eyes flickered, but her voice was steady. "Only what's in the public records. She was a tragic figure by all accounts. Died alone, no family to mourn her. Why do you ask?" "Oh, just an old woman's curiosity," Miss Marple said lightly. "The open grave has set tongues wagging, and I wondered if the past might shed light on the present." Miss Crane's lips thinned. "The past is best left buried, don't you think?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her gaze gentle but unwavering, "though it seems someone disagrees." As she walked home with Margaret, Miss Marple's thoughts churned. The locket, the letters, the schoolteacher's guarded words. They were all connected, she was sure, to the bells and the grave. But the connection was elusive, like a shadow moving just out of sight. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where gossip had often led her to the truth, and resolved to listen more closely to Chipping End's whispers. The village, she sensed, was holding its breath, waiting for the next note in its strange backward song. Chapter 5. The Missing Will. The morning sun cast long shadows across Chipping End, gilding the rooftops, but doing little to warm the chill that lingered in Miss Marple's thoughts. She sat in Margaret's parlour, a cup of tea cooling beside her, as she turned over the village's secrets like cards in a game of patience. The open grave, the backward bells, the vicar's letters, and now the whispers of a ruby locket, all pointed to a deeper motive, one tied to the Grayson family's faded legacy. Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Price, the baker's wife, her face flushed with excitement. "Miss Marple, Margaret, you'll never guess what's happened. They've found a will, Eleanor Grayson's will, hidden away in the manor all these years." Margaret's eyes widened. "A will? Where was it?" "In an old desk, up at Grayson Manor," Mrs. Price said, settling into a chair without invitation. Mr. Dobbs, the groundskeeper, was helping clear out some rubbish for the village council. "They're thinking of selling the place at last." He found a secret drawer, and there it was, all legal-like, signed and sealed. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "How extraordinary! And what does this will say?" Mrs. Price leaned forward, her voice dropping. "It leaves everything, manor, land, money, to a nephew, one Jonathan Grayson. Nobody knew he existed. But here's the thing. The will was never filed. Eleanor died, and her estate went to some distant cousin instead. That cousin's long dead, but his widow, old Mrs. Grayson, still lives out by the moor." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "And this Jonathan Grayson, has anyone traced him?" "Not yet," Mrs. Price said, "but the village is buzzing. Some say he's dead, others that he left England years ago. And then there's talk that the will might be why that grave was opened. Someone looking for proof, or maybe to destroy it." Margaret shivered. "It's all so unsettling. Aunt Jane, do you think the will's connected to the bells?" "It's likely," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "A missing will is a powerful motive. People will do strange things for money, or to keep it from others. I think I'd like to see Grayson Manor. Margaret, would you arrange a visit with Mr. Dobbs?" The manor stood on the edge of Chipping End, a crumbling relic of Georgian splendour, its windows dark and its gardens choked with weeds. Mr. Dobbs met them at the gate, his spade slung over one shoulder like a rifle. He was gruff but obliging, leading them through echoing halls to a dusty study where the desk still stood. "Here's where I found it," he said, tapping a mahogany desk scarred by time. Drawer was stuck, but I pried it open. The will was wrapped in oilcloth, like someone meant to keep it safe. Miss Marple examined the desk, her fingers tracing the wood. The secret drawer was cleverly hidden, its catch disguised as a knot in the grain. "And no one else had been in the manor recently?" she asked. "Not that I know," Dobbs said, scratching his beard. "Place has been locked up, tight, though I did find a window unlatched in the back a week or so ago. Thought it was just the wind." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze lingering on the window in question. Its frame was weathered, but the latch showed faint scratches as if forced. She stepped outside, circling the manor's perimeter, and noticed a patch of trampled grass near the unlatched window. A single thread, dark and coarse, clung to a thorn bush nearby. It matched the shred she'd found in the churchyard. Back at the cottage, Miss Marple spread her findings on the table, the cloth from the grave, the thread from the manor, and her notes on the will. "The pieces are coming together," she said to Margaret, who watched with wide eyes. "This will change everything. If Jonathan Grayson or his heirs are alive, they could claim the manor and whatever wealth remains. But someone, I think, wants that claim buried. Do you think it's old Mrs. Grayson?" Margaret asked. "She'd lose everything if the will stands." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "or someone else with a stake in the past. The vicar's letters, Miss Crane's research, Tom Weaver's odd behaviour, they all circle the Graysons. And then there's the locket Mrs. Tuttle mentioned. I wonder if it was more than a trinket." That evening, as the village settled into dusk, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting a soft rhythm in the quiet. The will was a spark, she thought, igniting old grudges and hidden hopes. But why dig up a grave? Why ring the bells backward? The answer lay in Chipping End's shadows, and she was determined to bring it into the light. Chapter 6. The Midnight Watcher. The moon hung low over Chipping End, its light fractured by the ever-present fog that curled around St. Mary's spire. Miss Marple, never one for sleepless nights unless necessity demanded, had decided that necessity had indeed arrived. The open grave, the missing will, and the village's tangled web of secrets all pointed to the church as the heart of the mystery. And so, wrapped in a shawl and armed with nothing but her sharp wits, she positioned herself in Margaret's garden, where a low hedge offered a clear view of the churchyard. She had chosen her spot carefully, hidden by the shadow of an ancient oak. The village clock struck midnight, its chimes muffled by the mist. Miss Marple's eyes, undimmed by age, scanned the churchyard silhouette. The open grave of Eleanor Grayson lay like a dark scar among the headstones, and she watched it with the patience of a cat at a mouse-hole. At 12:30, a faint movement caught her attention. A figure emerged from the lane beside the church, cloaked in a long coat and moving with cautious steps. The figure paused at the churchyard gate, glancing about before slipping inside. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she remained still, her breath steady. The figure approached the yew tree near Eleanor's grave, lingering there as if waiting or watching. Miss Marple strained to see more, but the fog obscured the figure's face. She noted the coat's heavy fabric, the way it dragged slightly on the grass, and the faint glint of something metallic at the figure's side. A tool, perhaps, or a key. After several minutes the figure moved again, circling the grave before vanishing into the shadows of the church's north wall. She waited, counting the minutes, but the figure did not reappear. The churchyard fell silent, save for the distant hoot of an owl. Miss Marple rose, her joints protesting, and made her way back to the cottage, her mind alight with questions. Who was the midnight watcher, and what had they sought? The grave was empty, the will found, yet something still drew them to St. Mary's. The next morning, over breakfast, she shared her observations with Margaret, omitting the more perilous details to spare her niece's nerves. "I believe someone is keeping watch on the churchyard," she said, buttering a scone, "and I suspect they know more about Eleanor Grayson's grave than they've let on." Margaret's eyes widened. "Aunt Jane, you didn't go out there alone, did you? It's dangerous. What if it was the person who opened the grave?" "Nonsense, my dear," Miss Marple said, though her tone was gentle. "An old woman like me is hardly a threat. But I must speak to Tom Weaver. He was in the bell tower when the bells rang backward, and he's been seen near the church often. He may have noticed something or someone." Tom Weaver was found at the village forge, where he worked as an apprentice. He was a lanky youth with a freckled face and a habit of avoiding eye contact. Miss Marple approached him with her usual disarming smile, offering a small jar of Margaret's jam as a pretext. "Good morning, Tom," she said. "I hear you've been helping Mr. Harrow with the bells. It must be quite a responsibility." Tom shrugged, wiping soot from his hands. "S'pose so. Not much to it, really. Just pull the ropes when I'm told." "And the night the bells rang backward?" Miss Marple asked, her voice light. "That must have been a shock." Tom's eyes flickered and he shifted his weight. "Didn't do it, if that's what you're thinking. I was in the tower, sure, but the ropes, they moved on their own. Swear it." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Moved on their own? How curious. Did you see anyone else in the church that night? Or perhaps near the churchyard afterward?" Tom hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Didn't see nobody, but I heard something after the bells stopped, like footsteps running out by the yew tree. Thought it was just the wind." "The yew tree," Miss Marple repeated, her mind flashing to the figure she'd seen. "Thank you, Tom. You've been most helpful." As she left the forge, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the church's north wall, where the figure had disappeared. The wall bordered a narrow path to the vicarage, she recalled, and the vicar's anxious demeanour loomed large in her mind. But there was also Miss Crane, with her secretive research, and old Mrs. Grayson, muttering of unpaid debts. The midnight watcher could be any of them, or someone yet unknown. Back at the cottage, she added Tom's account to her mental ledger, alongside the thread from the manor and the cloth from the grave. The metallic glint she'd seen troubled her most, a spade perhaps, or something more sinister. The churchyard, she sensed, held more secrets than an empty grave, and the midnight watcher was the key to unlocking them. Chapter 7. The crypt's clue, the air in St. Mary's Church, was cool and heavy, carrying the scent of stone and ancient wood. Miss Marple stood at the nave, her eyes tracing the worn flagstones that led to a small iron gate beneath the altar. The vicar had mentioned a crypt, rarely visited, where the oldest families of Chipping End were laid to rest. The open grave and the midnight watcher had set her mind on hidden places, and she sensed the crypt might hold answers the churchyard could not. Mr. Clement, ever obliging despite his nervous air, unlocked the gate with a rusted key. "It's not much used these days," he said, his voice echoing in the dimness. "The Grayson family has a vault down there, among others, but it's damp and crumbling. I wouldn't linger, Miss Marple." "Oh, I shan't," she replied, her tone cheerful. "Just a quick look, to satisfy an old woman's curiosity." The stone steps descended into shadow, and Miss Marple followed carefully, her stick tapping each step. The crypt was a low, vaulted chamber, its walls lined with stone slabs etched with names and dates. The air was thick, and a faint drip of water echoed from some unseen corner. Mr. Clement held a lantern, its light casting flickering patterns across the Grayson vault. "Here it is," he said, gesturing to a large slab inscribed with the family name. "Eleanor's not here, of course. She was buried above ground, but her parents and siblings are." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the vault. The slab was heavy, undisturbed for decades, but her attention was drawn to a smaller stone nearby, half hidden in the shadows. It bore no name, only a date, 1895. She knelt, ignoring the damp, and ran her fingers over the surface. A faint carving caught her eye, a crude symbol, like a cross with a broken arm, etched into the corner. "Mr. Clement," she said, her voice steady, "do you know what this stone covers?" The vicar peered closer, his brow furrowing. I'm not sure. The crypt's records are incomplete. It could be a servant's grave, or perhaps a stillborn child. The Graysons were private about such things." "Private indeed," Miss Marple murmured. She traced the symbol again, her mind racing. It was no Christian mark, but something older, almost pagan. She had seen its like once, in a book on village folklore, tied to rituals of protection or concealment. As they climbed back to the church, Miss Marple's thoughts churned. The crypt's clue was small but significant, a thread linking the Grayson family to something buried deeper than their wealth. The broken cross suggested a secret kept not just from the village, but from history itself. Was it tied to Eleanor's grave, or to the will that had surfaced so conveniently? That afternoon she visited the village hall, where Miss Crane was said to keep her historical notes. The schoolteacher was there, sorting through a box of yellow documents, her expression guarded as Miss Marple approached. "Good day, Miss Crane," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "I hear you've been delving into Chipping End's past. Have you come across any symbols in your research? A cross, perhaps, with a broken arm?" Miss Crane's hand paused over a document, her eyes narrowing. "A broken cross? That's unusual. I've seen mentions of old markers in the churchyard, but nothing specific. Why do you ask?" "Oh, just something I noticed," Miss Marple said lightly. "The Grayson family seems full of mysteries, don't they?" The schoolteacher's lips twitched, but she said nothing more, returning to her papers with a pointed air of dismissal. Miss Marple left, satisfied. Miss Crane knew more than she admitted. Her hesitation had betrayed her. The broken cross was a key, and someone in Chipping End feared its discovery. Back at the cottage, Miss Marple sketched the I symbol in her notebook, alongside her notes on the will, the locket, and the midnight watcher. The crypt had given her a glimpse of the past, but it was the present that troubled her most. The bells, the grave, the watcher, all were part of a pattern, and the broken cross was its oldest stitch. She thought of the vicar's letters, Tom's footsteps by the yew tree, and old Mrs. Grayson's mutterings. The truth, she sensed, was close, but it would take another night in the churchyard to draw it out. Chapter 8. The Stranger's Arrival. The village of Chipping End was no stranger to visitors, but the man who stepped off the evening bus at the village green drew every eye. He was tall, with a weathered face and a tweed coat that had seen better days, his eyes scanning the surroundings with a mix of wariness and purpose. Miss Marple, sipping tea at the window of Margaret's cottage, noted his arrival with interest. Strangers were rare in Chipping End, and this one, she sensed, was no mere passer-by. By noon, the village was abuzz with talk of the newcomer. Mrs. Tuttle, ever the hub of gossip, shared the news at the post office. "Calls himself Arthur Grayson," she told Miss Marple, who had stopped by with a letter to post. "Claims he's a descendant of the Grayson family, come to see about the manor now that the will's turned up, staying at the Red Lion, bold as brass." "Arthur Grayson," Miss Marple repeated, her knitting needles clicking softly. "How curious! And what does he say about his connection to Eleanor Grayson?" "Says he's her great-nephew through her brother's line," Mrs. Tuttle said, leaning over the counter. "Born abroad he was in Canada or some such place. Heard about the will through a solicitor's letter, or so he claims. But I don't trust him, Miss Marple. Those eyes of his, sharp, like he's looking for something." Miss Marple smiled, tucking her letter into the post-box. "Eyes can tell a great deal, Mrs. Tuttle. Has he visited the manor yet?" "Not yet," the postmistress said. "But he's been asking about the church and Eleanor's grave. Makes my skin crawl with all that's happened." That afternoon Miss Marple made her way to the Red Lion, a cosy inn with low beams and a roaring fire. Arthur Grayson sat alone in the corner, nursing a pint and studying a folded map. She approached, with her usual air of harmless curiosity, her basket of knitting in hand. "Good day, Mr. Grayson," she said, settling into a nearby chair. "I'm Jane Marple, visiting my niece here. The village is quite taken with your arrival." Grayson looked up, his eyes narrowing briefly before softening into a polite smile. "Miss Marple, is it? A pleasure. I didn't mean to cause a stir, just here to settle some family matters." "The Grayson will, I presume," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "It's caused quite a stir itself, turning up after all these years." He nodded, his fingers tightening on the map. "My great-uncle Jonathan was named in it, you see. I'm his grandson. Thought I'd come see if there's anything left of the old place." "And the church?" Miss Marple asked, her eyes gentle but keen. "I hear you've been asking about Eleanor's grave." Grayson's smile faltered, just for a moment. "Curiosity, nothing more. Family history, you know. That open grave business, odd, isn't it?" "Very odd," Miss Marple agreed. "Almost as odd as bells ringing backward." He met her gaze, and for an instant she saw something flicker in his eyes. Caution, perhaps, or recognition. Bells, graves, this village has its share of mysteries, he said, folding the map. I'm just here for answers, Miss Marple nodded, rising with a smile. Answers have a way of surfacing, Mr. Grayson. Do enjoy your stay. As she left the inn, her mind was busy. Arthur Grayson's story was plausible, but his timing was too convenient. His interest in the grave, too, pointed. She thought of the midnight watcher, the broken cross in the crypt, and the threads of cloth that tied the churchyard to the manor. Was Grayson the watcher, come to claim his inheritance, or to bury a secret? That evening, she shared her thoughts with Margaret, who was setting out supper. This Arthur Grayson, Miss Marple said, he's either a man with a rightful claim, or one with something to hide. I'd like to know more about that map he was studying, and I think another visit to the churchyard is in order. Margaret paled. Aunt Jane, you're not going out there again at night, are you? What if he's dangerous? Oh, my dear, Miss Marple said, patting her hand, danger is often just misunderstanding in a hurry, but I shall be careful. The stranger's arrival has stirred the pot, and I intend to see what rises to the surface. As night fell, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting a soft rhythm in the quiet. The village was holding its breath, she thought, and Arthur Grayson was a new note in its strange song. Whether he was hunter or hunted, she would find out, starting with the shadows of St. Mary's. Chapter 9. The Locked Room. The quiet of Chipping End was shattered the next morning by a scream that echoed from the Red Lion. Miss Marple, who had been enjoying a second cup of tea at Margaret's cottage, set her cup down with a sigh. Trouble, she knew, had a way of announcing itself, and this sounded like trouble indeed. She gathered her shawl and hurried toward the inn, Margaret trailing anxiously behind. A small crowd had already gathered outside the Red Lion, their faces pale and their whispers urgent. Mrs. Tuttle, ever at the heart of village news, met Miss Marple at the door. "It's awful, Miss Marple! Mr. Grayson, Arthur Grayson, he's dead! Found in his room, and the door locked from the inside." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Locked, you say? How was the body discovered?" The innkeeper, Mr. Barlow, heard a thud last night, but thought nothing of it, Mrs. Tuttle said, wringing her hands. "This morning, when Grayson didn't. Come down!" Barlow knocked. No answer. He broke the door down, and there he was, stabbed right through the heart. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already turning. A locked-room murder was no small matter, and Arthur Grayson's death so soon after his arrival was no coincidence. She stepped into the inn where Mr. Barlow, a burly man with a red face, was speaking to the local constable, a young man named Harris. "Miss Marple," Constable Harris said, tipping his hat. "You've a knack for these things, I hear. Care to take a look?" "I'd be glad to assist," she said, her tone modest. She followed him upstairs to Grayson's room, a small chamber with a single window and a heavy oak door. The lock was intact, its key still in place on the inside. Arthur Grayson lay sprawled on the floor, a knife protruding from his chest. His map, now blood-stained, lay crumpled beside him. Miss Marple knelt, careful not to disturb the scene. The knife was plain, the kind found in any kitchen, but its blade was sharp and clean, save for the blood. She noted Grayson's coat, flung over a chair, and the window, securely latched from within. The room was a puzzle, sealed tight as a drum. "Any signs of a struggle?" she asked the constable. "None," Harris said, scratching his head. "No marks on the door, no scratches on the window. It's as if the killer vanished into thin air." Miss Marple's lips twitched. "Killers, in my experience, are rarely so obliging. Tell me, Mr. Barlow, who else was in the inn last night?" The innkeeper rubbed his chin. "Just the usual lot. Myself, the cook, and 2 guests besides Grayson. Miss Crane was here working on her papers in the parlour, and old Mrs. Grayson, who comes in sometimes for a sherry. Both left before midnight. Miss Crane and Mrs. Grayson," Miss Marple repeated, her eyes narrowing. "And no one heard anything unusual save the thud." Barlow shook his head. "Not a peep. The walls are thick, mind." Miss Marple examined the map, careful to touch only its edges. It was a rough sketch of Chipping End, with St. Mary's Church and the manor marked in red ink. A small cross, eerily like the one in the crypt, was drawn near the churchyard's yew tree. She folded it carefully and handed it to Constable Harris. "This may be important," she said, as they left. The room, Miss Marple's thoughts raced. A locked room suggested planning, not passion, and the knife's ordinariness hinted at opportunity. Grayson's death was tied to his claim on the will, she was certain. But how had the killer entered and escaped? She recalled the midnight watcher, the threads of cloth, and the broken cross. The churchyard, it seemed, was still the heart of the mystery. Back at the cottage, Margaret was near tears. "Aunt Jane, a murder! And in a locked room! How could it happen?" "Locked rooms are merely doors someone has found a way through," Miss Marple said, patting her niece's hand. "The question is not how, but why. Arthur Grayson came for the will, and someone ensured he'd never claim it. I think it's time I spoke to Miss Crane again, and perhaps old Mrs. Grayson." She sat by the fire that evening, her knitting, a steady rhythm. The locked room was a challenge, but not insoluble. The killer had left no trace, yet traces were everywhere. In the map, the cross, the bells that rang backward. Miss Marple's mind wove them together, each thread tightening the net around a truth that grew ever clearer. Chapter 10. The Family Secret. The wind howled across the moor, carrying a bite that made Miss Marple pull her shawl tighter as she approached the small weathered cottage where old Mrs. Grayson lived. The murder of Arthur Grayson had cast a pall over Chipping End, and Miss Marple knew the answers lay not only in the present, but in the shadowed past of the Grayson family. Mrs. Grayson, widow of Eleanor's cousin, was the last living link to that legacy, and her mutterings of debts unpaid had taken on new weight. The cottage was a squat, stone affair, its windows curtained and its garden overgrown. Miss Marple knocked, her stick resting lightly against the door frame. After a long pause, the door creaked open, revealing Mrs. Grayson, a frail woman with sharp eyes and a face etched with suspicion. "Who's this?" she rasped, peering at Miss Marple. "I don't take visitors." "Jane Marple, Mrs. Grayson," she said, her smile gentle. "I'm visiting my niece Margaret, and I've brought some of her jam. May I come in? I'd like to talk about the Grayson family." The old woman's eyes narrowed, but she stepped aside, gesturing to a cluttered parlour. "Talk then, but I've nothing to say about that lot. Cursed they were, and I'm glad to be rid of them." Miss Marple settled into a creaking chair. noting the faded photographs on the mantel. One of a stern man, likely Mrs. Grayson's late husband, and another of a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Eleanor Grayson. "Cursed, you say? That's a strong word. Was it because of Eleanor?" Mrs. Grayson snorted, her hands twisting a frayed handkerchief. "Eleanor was the worst of 'em. Mad as a March hare, wandering the moors, talking to ghosts. But it wasn't just her. The whole family. Secrets, always secrets. My husband tried to keep 'em buried, but they never stay down." "What kind of secrets?" Miss Marple asked, her tone one of polite curiosity. The old woman's gaze darted to the window, as if expecting someone to listen. "Debts, for one. Not money, blood. Eleanor's father did something wrong, long before my time. Folks said it was why the family fell apart, why Eleanor died alone." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes keen. "And this wrong, did it involve a symbol? A cross with a broken arm, perhaps?" Mrs. Grayson froze, her handkerchief falling to the floor. "How do you know that?" she whispered. "That mark. It was forbidden. My husband said it was tied to a sin, something buried in the crypt. He'd never speak of it, but he feared it." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The broken cross, etched in the crypt and marked on Arthur Grayson's map, was no mere coincidence. It was a sign of a crime, perhaps, or a pact, hidden by the Graysons for generations. "And Arthur Grayson," she said softly. "Did he come to you, asking about the family?" Mrs. Grayson's face hardened. "He came all right. 2 days ago, bold as you please, asking about the will, the manor, the crypt. I told him to leave the past alone, but he wouldn't listen. Said he had a right to it all. Now he's dead, and good riddance." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "You were at the Red Lion the night he died, I hear." The old woman's eyes flashed. "For a sherry, nothing more. I left before anything happened. You think I'd kill him? I'm old, not stupid." "Of course not," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing. "But someone did. And I wonder if they feared what Arthur knew, or what he might uncover." As she left the cottage, the wind stung her cheeks, but her thoughts were clear. The Grayson family's secret was tied to the crypt's broken cross, and Arthur's murder was its latest consequence. She recalled the locked room, the knife, and the map's markings. The killer had acted to protect something. Perhaps the manor, perhaps the truth. Back at Margaret's cottage, she shared her findings over tea. "The Graysons hid a sin," she said, her knitting needles clicking. "Something so grave it marked their crypt and drove Eleanor to madness. Arthur Grayson came too close to it, and it cost him his life." Margaret shivered. "But what could be so terrible, Aunt Jane? And who's behind it?" "Someone who knows the past," Miss Marple said. "Miss Crane, with her research, or the vicar, with his letters. Even Tom Weaver might know more than he says, but the crypt holds the key, and I think the bells will ring again before we're done." That night, as the village slept, Miss Marple sat by the window, her eyes on St. Mary's spire. The family secret was a thread running through every clue. The grave, the will, the murder. She was close, she knew, but the final piece lay just out of reach, waiting in the shadows of Chipping End's haunted heart. Chapter 11. The bells ring again. The fog returned to Chipping End that evening, thicker than before, wrapping the village in a shroud that muffled sound and blurred the edges of the world. Miss Marple sat in Margaret's parlour, her knitting abandoned as she listened to the distant hum of the village settling into night. Her thoughts were on the crypt's broken cross, Arthur Grayson's murder, and the family secret that bound them. She sensed the mystery was nearing its climax, and when the bells of St. Mary's began to toll at 10:30, ringing backward once more, she was not surprised Margaret gasped, dropping her teacup. "Aunt Jane, the bells! Again! What does it mean?" "It means," Miss Marple said, rising with a calm that belied her racing mind, "that someone is desperate to keep our attention, or to divert it. Stay here, my dear. I must see to this." Despite Margaret's protests, Miss Marple donned her shawl and slipped out, her stick tapping softly as she made her way to St. Mary's. The fog was dense, but she knew the path by heart now, her senses attuned to the slightest sound. The bells clanged their eerie, inverted melody, each note a challenge to the village's fragile peace. At the churchyard gate she paused, her eyes scanning the shadows. The bells stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the fog. She moved toward the bell tower, its door slightly ajar, and peered inside. The ropes hung still, but a faint creak from above suggested movement. She hesitated, then turned her attention to the churchyard, where the yew tree stood sentinel over Eleanor Grayson's empty grave. A soft rustle drew her gaze to the north wall, where a figure emerged from the mist. It was Tom Weaver, his face pale and his hands clutching a small, heavy object. A wrench, Miss Marple noted, its metal glinting in the moonlight. He froze when he saw her, his eyes wide with panic. "Tom," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm. "What are you doing here? I didn't mean no harm," he stammered, backing away. "Just checking the bells like Mr. Harrow asked." "At this hour?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "And with a wrench? Come now, Tom. You heard the bells, same as I did. Who rang them?" Tom's shoulders sagged, and he looked at the ground. "I don't know, Miss Marple, I swear. I was in the forge when they started, but I found something in the tower after the first time. A gear tampered with, so the bells ring wrong. I didn't tell nobody, 'cause I was scared." "Scared of what?" Miss Marple pressed, stepping closer. "Of whoever did it," Tom whispered. "There's summat wrong in this village, miss. Summat old and bad. I think it's why Mr. Grayson was killed." Miss Marple nodded, her mind piecing together the clues. The tampered gear explained the backward bells, a deliberate act, not a ghostly one. But who had the skill and the motive to sabotage the tower? She thought of the vicar's anxiety, Miss Crane's secretive research, and old Mrs. Grayson's talk of blood debts. "Show me this gear, Tom," she said. Reluctantly, he led her to the tower, where a small brass gear lay hidden behind a crate. It was scratched and bent, its teeth misaligned to reverse the bell's sequence. Miss Marple examined it, noting a faint trace of oil that matched the metallic glint she'd seen on the midnight watcher's tool. "Well done, Tom," she said. "This is important, but you must tell Constable Harris everything. No more secrets." Tom nodded, his face a mix of relief and fear. As they left the tower, Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the church's north wall, where the path to the vicarage lay hidden in the fog. The bells had rung to distract, she was certain, but from what? The crypt's broken cross, Arthur's map, and now the tampered gear. All pointed to a truth buried deep, one the killer would kill again to protect. Back at the cottage, she reassured a frantic Margaret, then sat by the fire, her notebook open. The bells were a signal, she thought, a warning or a taunt. The killer was close, their steps echoing in the fog, and the final piece of the puzzle was within reach. She needed only one more thread to tie it all together, and she suspected the vicarage held it. Chapter 12. The Final Revelation. The morning sun struggled through the fog, casting a pale glow over St. Mary's Church, as Miss Marple gathered the key players in the nave. The vicar, Mr. Clement, stood nervously by the altar, his hands clasped tightly. Miss Crane, the schoolteacher, sat stiffly in a pew, her eyes guarded. Old Mrs. Grayson, summoned with some difficulty, glowered from a corner, her cane tapping impatiently. Tom Weaver hovered near the door, looking as if he'd rather be anywhere else. Constable Harris stood by, his notebook ready, while Margaret watched from the back, her face pale with anticipation. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice clear and calm. "Thank you all for coming. Chipping End has seen strange days, backward bells, an open grave, a murder in a locked room. But these are not mysteries without answers. They are the work of human hands, driven by a secret buried in the Grayson family's past." She held up her notebook, its pages filled with neat script. It began with Eleanor Grayson's grave, opened not for theft, but to send a message. The bells rang backward to draw attention, or to distract from it. And Arthur Grayson, who came seeking his inheritance, was killed to keep a truth from surfacing. That truth lies in a symbol, a broken cross, etched in the crypt and marked on a map. Mr. Clement shifted, his face ashen. "Miss Marple, surely you don't think—" "I think," she interrupted gently, "that you know more than you've said, Mr. Clement. Your letters, arriving in plain envelopes, caused you great distress. They were warnings, weren't they, about a sin committed by Eleanor's father, one you discovered in the parish records?" The vicar's shoulders slumped. "Yes," he whispered. "I found a hidden note in the crypt's records years ago. It spoke of a child, a secret child, born to Eleanor's father and a servant. The child was disposed of, buried in the crypt under that unmarked stone. The broken cross marked the grave, a symbol of shame." Miss Marple nodded, and Eleanor, who knew of this sin, was driven to madness by it. Her will, naming her nephew Jonathan, was hidden to protect the family's name. But someone else knew, someone who used that knowledge to manipulate events. She turned to Miss Crane, whose face had gone rigid. "Miss Crane, your research was no mere history project. You found references to the broken cross in old village journals, didn't you? And you realized it tied to the Grayson fortune." Miss Crane's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. "You wrote those letters to the vicar, threatening to expose the secret unless he helped you. You tampered with the bell tower's gear, ensuring the bells rang backward to stir fear and distract the village. And you opened Eleanor's grave, knowing it would spark talk of the Grayson past." Old Mrs. Grayson gasped, her cane clattering to the floor. "You? But why?" "Because," Miss Marple said, "Miss Crane is no stranger to the Graysons. She is the granddaughter of that secret child, born to the servant and raised in secrecy. She came to Chipping End not as a schoolteacher, but as an heir. seeking the fortune denied her family. Arthur Grayson's arrival threatened her claim, so she killed him, using a knife from the Red Lion's kitchen and a hidden panel in his room's wall, a panel she knew from her research into the manor's old plans. Constable Harris stepped forward, his eyes wide. A panel! But the room was locked. Locked, but not sealed, Miss Marple said. The Red Lion was once part of the Grayson estate. Miss Crane found the panel's mechanism, slipped in, and stabbed Arthur as he studied his map. She left the same way, locking the door behind her to create the illusion of a mystery. Miss Crane rose, her face a mask of defiance. "You can't prove it," she said, her voice low. "It's all conjecture." Miss Marple held up a small, coarse thread. "This was found in the manor's thorn bush, and matches the cloth from the grave. It comes from your coat, Miss Crane, the same coat you wore as the Midnight Watcher. And Tom Weaver's gear, tampered with oil from your lantern, seals your guilt." Tom nodded, his voice shaking. "I saw her, that second night near the tower. Didn't want to say, but it's true." Miss Crane's defiance crumbled, and she sank back into the pew, her hands covering her face. Constable Harris moved to her side, his voice gentle but firm. "You'll need to come with me, Miss Crane." As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple stood by Eleanor's grave, now closed and quiet. Margaret joined her, her eyes full of awe. "Aunt, Jane, how did you know?" "People, my dear," Miss Marple said, her smile soft, "are much like villages. They hold their secrets close, but they always leave a trace. A thread, a glance, a bell rung backward. You only need to listen." The Dieku fog lifted as they walked home, and St. Mary's bells rang out, clear and true, as if Chipping End had finally found its peace.